Hi, Gregg Perry here in the clock shop, in actually the test running room. We have a couple stands here. Just want to go over a few things. This is for prospective clients that want to have their clocks fixed. I talked to several people, I get a lot of phone calls. Clients don't quite understand it. I've had a couple calls this week to go into houses, and some of the clients seem to think that you can actually work on their clocks in their house, do a service in their house. And as I explained to them, probably for the past 350 years, maybe 400 years, clocks and watches have been taken back to the clock or watchmaker's bench where they're serviced there. They're evaluated, disassembled, repaired, restored, put back together, and then delivered back to the client. This is a misnomer that's been carried around, even particularly here in Salem County. We've had 2 or 3 charlatans, fakes, frauds, and forgers that have called themselves clockmakers possibly for the last 10, 15, 20 years. In actual fact, they know nothing of doing clocks. They take some clocks in, they divvy them up to some people they know work on them, even though they're not certified. So for anyone out there, prospective client that wants to have your clock or watch done, make sure your clockmaker, the person you're talking to, has qualifications. Is going to the British Horological Institute, the NAWCC School of Horology, or the AWI. But I must warn that just because the National Watch and Clock Association, just because they have a number, too many people will have a user number or a member number. That means nothing, absolutely nothing. They have, for the most part, most of the people in the NAWC have no qualifications to work on clocks or watches. They're strictly collectors. But charlatans use this number as if it were a commitment or certificate or some type of educational boundary that they can work on clocks and watches. So please disregard this. And there are some companies out there, some companies that come around and say, we can work on your clock out in our truck, we can service it. They're doing a total disservice to you and your object. They're actually taking the clock out of your potential case, putting it in solvents in the truck, drying it off. This is not how clocks have been maintained for the last 350 years. In my time with the National Watch and Clock Museum, this is not presented this way. Our presentation is you service a clock, every 5 to 6 years you oil the clock by a certified individual, and then every 10 to 12 years you do a tear down or service on that clock. And this happens every 10 or 12 years, over and over again. And I run into too many people where the husband seems to know a little bit to make him quite dangerous about lubrication. Maybe he's works as a mechanic somewhere, and everybody wants to oil these types of 18th century movements every year, every 6 months. And what happens is, and we touched briefly on it last time, you have the 2 plates. You have the wheels that are on axles going through the plates. And this area here is called the bushing or bearing surface. It's where the axle is making contact with the hull of the plate of the mechanism. So for those people who like to oil these every 6 months, every year, what happens, even though your clock is oiled, the axle is floating on a polymer of oil. There's still dirt that gets attracted there. There's dust created because the axles are generally in steel and the mechanism is in brass. So you get a brass dust collecting at the bottom of the bushing area or the bottom of the hole in the plate. Every time you re-oil that, you recirculate around this axle all the particles of brass, any abrasives that are in the air, and again, it turns into a grinding paste and it increases the size of the hole that the axle, or the arbor as we call it in horology, is going through. So when you do that, some of the bottom gears, the teeth and the pinions, drop down. So when they drop down, eventually they can break off teeth or cause so much friction they'll stop the movement from running. So that's where we are with that. And the last thing is, don't use any solvents like a WD-40 and things like this. They're great short-term nut breakers, bolt releasers. Other than that, they actually have some solvents in there that'll break down the lead. In brass, there's a lead content. It'll go in, molecularly speaking, inside this solvent that they're putting on, and it'll actually break down the lead. When it breaks down the lead, these plates are flat, and sometimes the plate will spring and become almost somewhat like a potato chip, and then you're going to have your gears binding. So we do not use WD-40 ever. It's a no-no. So anyway, that's it for warnings to the possible client. Please again check qualifications for anyone that's going to work on a clock or watch. Thank you very much.